Today on the Mr. Maple podcast, Tim and Matt count down the top 20 Acer species.
Hey guys, welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. I'm Matt. This is your weekly maple talk show where we talk about Japanese maples and so much more. I think we got a good topic for you today.
Hey Maple Mafia out there, I'm Tim. Make sure that you find us on our favorite podcast platform. We put out a weekly podcast on Japanese maples and gardening. So if you love gardening, make sure you're subscribed. And we also put out daily content on our YouTube channel, the Mr. Maple Show. So check us out there as well. And today we're bringing you the top 20 maple species.
Yeah, so this is a topic we love. We've broke these things down in a lot of different ways. Today we're going to be talking about some Acer species, and we've picked a few that we'll like, certainly because they have a lot of cultivars in them. So you can imagine some of these have more cultivars than other, but for one reason or another, we really are drawn to these Acer species, and they're just some of our favorites. They kind of catch the eye. They have something a little extra going on to them. Now, not all of these have a lot of cultivars in them. Some of these we picked that have 0 cultivars or 1, but we just like the overall aesthetic that species brings.
I remember when we had, 200, 300 cultivars. We were at the Maple Society meeting for the very first time, and we had so many cultivars of Japanese maples. And Sue Wigriff and Tim were out there, and they said, guys, there's so many great species out there. You got to check this out. You got to check this out. And that started to open our eyes to these different maple species. And there's so many things that are closely related to Japanese maples. There's some that aren't at all, that are just amazing trees to grow in your garden. And I hope these top 20 maple species grabs your attention and helps you check out some of these cool maples that you might not have commonly looked at because they're a species maple.
There are a lot of interesting traits going on here, and it adds to the overall diversity of what you see, especially with Japanese maples. So if your garden is just Japanese maple centric, hopefully this podcast opens your eyes up a little bit to some of these other genetics out there, some of these other species that can kind of bring a little bit of interesting things to the table as well.
Now, there may be some Japanese maples on here as well because they're maple species. But we're going to start out with number 20, which is Acer circinatum. And this is a plant that was found by Persh on the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was the horticulturalist who put this onto a piece of paper and said, this is a new species. And it was introduced, essentially by him because he put the name on it. I mean, there are so many cool things about Acer circinatum. I remember when we were on the Maple Society Post Tour and we went to Mount St. Helens and we were going around and seeing all these Acer circinatums in fall color. Mm-hmm. And they grabbed my attention. I mean, Matt and I were like, wow, these things are pretty unique and pretty special. I think we came back with a couple of buckets full of Acer circinatum seed.
Right. They're a super unique thing. I mean, they're essentially, compatible with Japanese maples. They graft onto palmatum. They're in section palmata. A lot of people consider them Japanese maples, and many of the cultivars we do are likely hybrids with palmatum, giving them some of those more unique traits. But it's basically essentially a native to the Pacific Northwest that is compatible with its Asian cousins. So it actually works with, Acer shirasawatum, Acer palmatum, maybe even some hybridization going on there. Acer circinatum is one of the most diverse groups, too, that we'll be talking about. It has a ton of cultivars within this. I actually think another interesting tidbit, there are a few brooms in sugar maples, but I think circinatum may be one of the only other things in section palmata besides palmatum that we have brooms going on in. So there's definitely cultivars selected because they're brooms like Dell's Dwarf, Highway 204, which has become a couple different things. But there's several circinatum cultivars that were selected as witches brooms, which gives it a unique set of traits as well. I think one other neat thing about Acer circinatum is, it's actually what you see in the Army as an oak leaf. So if you look at an oak leaf cluster in the Army, it doesn't really look like an oak leaf. If you break it down, I've never seen an oak leaf that looks like that. I certainly have seen an Acer circinatum that looks like that, though.
It does very much look just like an Acer circinatum leaf. And I think people always call it an oak leaf because most people don't know what a vine maple is. The Acer circinatum vine maple, it's a shrubby plant. It grows very multi-stemmed out there in the wild. Some people actually will graft to them, but I don't recommend it because they do become very multi-stem, meaning they shoot up shoots from the base of the tree as it grows. And because of that, if you grafted a weeping lace leaf to it, you're going to have a lot of suckers coming from below the graft down low close to the ground. But Circinatum is an interesting plant. It gives good fall color. It does very well in that Pacific Northwest climate. But I've noticed that they do much better in the ground than they do in containers. Mm-hmm. And so if you've got one you're wanting to try all it out, grow it in the ground. You're going to have a much better success with Acer Circinatum out there in the ground than you do growing in a container.
Coming here at number 19, we've got Acer Seriferum.
Guys, this is also known as Acer robustum. This has it's almost in between like an Acer amenum leaf and an Acer shirasawanum. I mean, you've got that larger rounded leaf, and this is a species from China that is a large green foliage with a bright orange fall color.
Now, I'm out of my element saying this, but you wonder if it doesn't have more of that ploidiness to it, like it is more of a tetraploid. They're typically dense and full, thicker foliage. I love the yellows to oranges this one brings in the fall. It's an interesting plant in that it's extremely durable. It's in section palmata. It grafts right onto palmatum as well. Comes back fairly true from form from seed. There's not a lot of selection done in this category, although Tim and I love this one, so we do go through a good bit of seeds looking for diversity here. If you don't know already, Tim and I like to look through, the other section palmata plants to kind of look for new and interesting things. And this is one of our favorite categories. I think it's got excellent durability, fall color, and overall shape, that denser, shorter shape, that thicker stemming, and kind of a little bit thicker leaf. I mean, it's not quite at Ruby Ridge level thickness, but it's definitely a little thicker than most of your Acer japonicums or circinatums.
Now, one of the reasons Matt and I love this plant too is it does appear to have some sort of frost resistance to it. And that means that this plant makes a great tree out there in the garden. I think Don Shadow once said, check out this Acer robustum I have. It's not getting any frost burn, and all the other trees in the garden got hit by heavy frost, and the Acer seriferum, also known as Acer robustum, did not. And he was like, man, check this out. And we went back and checked ours out, and we're like, man, ours didn't get hit either with the cold snap. It wasn't just his selection. It was the straight species was that frost resistant, which gives it a little extra superpower. And Matt and I like to talk about a lot of these plants and think, hey, what is this plant's superpower? And that one's definitely got a cool one.
For most people, they're going to look at this. It's going to be a big leaf, similar almost to an amoenum with a little bit of like shirasawanum size to it. I mean, it's kind of between those two things to make it palatable to what a lot of people might not know. But it has an excellent natural fall color. Like, not even a selection needs to be made for fall color because the natural species has excellent yellows to oranges. I've seen some brilliant yellows. So if you're looking to add yellow to your maple collection, maybe Acer seriferum would be a good choice, even the straight species.
Now, coming up next at number 18, we have Acer elegantium. This is the elegant maple. It's a selection that's very native to China, and it's very prolific out there in China. But this is a plant that is a nice straight upright tree, very heat tolerant as well. Does extremely well in those high heat settings.
Yeah, it's got a little bit more elongated of a leaf. The leaf is kind of interesting. It's typically a little bit more stretched out, a little faster growing sometimes than some of the others in section palmata. I find it to be a very interesting tree. There's really only one cultivar selection made of this, and it may be a hybrid with palmatum. I've had some pretty high level maple people take a look at it, and they felt that it had elegantium X palmatum in it, and that's Johnny's Giant, which was a selection by Harold Johnson.
Yeah, and that is a very heat tolerant selection as well. The straight species, I think we first came to know about it through Brian Upchurch when we bought Highland Creek Nursery, and he had a clone of it that was fantastic. They've got one of the J.C. Rouse and Arboretum, and we've been producing from that clone as well. And it was just a good, strong grower and had really good fall colors of bright yellows to with some orange involved in that. Now, Acer elegantium has a little bit sharper of a foliage. It has very sharp points with a very thin serrated edge. Mm-hmm. And it gives a very crisp look to a upright tree that's very closely related to many of the Japanese maples. The seeds on this are a little bit more unusual than most palmatums too. The seeds curve a lot more than most of the other plants that are in section palmata. It's really different, super heat tolerant, and we've grown this tree from seed, and I really hadn't found much variability in Acer elegantium as well.
Yeah, it's exceptionally heat tolerant. I will say it's a little bit more zone 6 through 9, so it doesn't quite go down to zone 5 unless it has some palmatum influence in it. Faster growth rate, too, typically at around 15 to 18 feet, even in 10 years, so it does get out there a little bit faster than, say, your typical Acer palmatum seedling.
So coming in at number 17, we've got our first evergreen maple on the list, and this is Acer laevigatum.
Now, these can be semi-evergreen. There's different levels there. I love with Acer laevigatum how you get that kind of new growth splash on it sometimes. I've had these that look like flowers because of that new growth.
Yeah, Acer laevigatum is known for being a plant that does well at higher elevations. Even in these more temperate climates where they're finding Acer laevigatum in the wild as an evergreen maple, they're finding them at higher elevations, which shows that it's a little more cold tolerant than many of the other evergreen species. But Acer laevigatum is one of those plants that is just a rock star. Now, one thing we've learned about this plant is you want to give it protection from the hot afternoon sun. Many of these evergreen maples, especially with Acer laevigatum, if you grow it in more sun, you'll get a lot of burn on that foliage. Give it some protection, grow it in a dappled light or morning sun afternoon shade situation, and that laevigatum's really going to, really display some of its full characteristics.
Yeah, this one's very interesting. There's not many cultivar selections in this one, although there is Acer laevigatum Hong Long, which is a selection by our good friend Mark Wethington, who's the director at the J.C. Ralston. And it's an interesting take on laevigatum. One fun thing about this one is it has more purple bark than the species, has kind of a burgundyish bark to it. You get these kind of translucent blue-green foliage going on as well, to even kind of purplish foliage. Mark wild collected this one and sent us, we were allowed to collect some sign off one of the original trees. And we kept telling him, like, this needs cultivar status. And he said, I don't know, guys. And I said, well, if you don't name it soon, I'm just going to call it Mark Wethington and put it into the trade. So we're going to name it you because this is so different than everything else we're growing as laevigatum. So there at least is one unique selection. It was originally wild collected, so it definitely has that native species trait to it. But some unique variability going on there with Hong Long.
And that's one of the cool things about many of these species we're talking about. Many of these are actually wild collected if you find them in a garden center. At some point, somebody wild collected them. That's why they're the straight species rather than a cultivar selection. And because that many times there's so many cool stories about when these plants were found, these explorers that found them went on this cyno-botanical expedition and brought this back to England, and then it made its way to New York.
Check out our podcast with Douglas Justice if you like plant exploration. I know that's a great entryway to learning about that. We're going to interview some other fun plant collectors who wild collect Acers soon. But check that one out with Douglas Justice. We call him the Indiana Jones of Japanese maples. I think that might have been one of Sean's takes, but good way to describe it. It's super cool. It's adventurous. And I think once people get those stories, those species too, like, oh my gosh, does that not make it palatable for the home garden? I mean, a lot of us collect plants because of the stories. And when you get that adventure to it, I mean, I get excited just thinking about it. All right, well, coming in here at number 16, we ventured out of section Palmata for this section. For this one, at number 16, we've got Acer triflorum.
Guys, this is the 3-flower maple, and I don't know why everyone focuses on the flower, calling it with a common name. We call it the shaggy bark maple,
right?
And it's because this plant has such amazing shaggy bark. It's pretty spectacular for winter interest, and it does have that trifoliate leaf, very similar to like the paper bark maple.
Oh, I love Acer triflorum. This thing's durable as all get out. It's performed very well in the Deep South. I would say in a lot of the Deep South areas, although I've seen Grisium at, Nacogdoches, Texas. So it certainly can do well too. I think it might be a misnomer that it can't. But triflorum has typically outperformed it in high heat areas in full sun. I've seen it do very well. You get that shaggy exfoliating bark. So the bark is just kind of funky already. Great fall colors. I mean, it's not uncommon for triflorum to be brilliant shades of orange to red. I've even had some yellows in it some seasons. Another one that I've noticed, even in full leaf here, has taken extreme frost and extreme colds. We had 19 this year after our 20-foot plus Acer triflorum was completely in leaf, and it had little or no damage to it, which I think is a really impressive trait.
Yeah, and there aren't many selections of Acer triflorum. There's Acer triflorum aureum, which is a more yellow-green, bright yellow-green foliage one when it leaves out. And then we actually have a dwarf selection of an Acer triflorum here at MrMaple as well. There's not many selections in that Acer triflorum, and there's so much room to be done there, so many cool things with this plant because, again, this is a plant many people can grow. It's very heat tolerant. It gives good winter interest, and it's got great fall color. So triflorum, I mean, at number 16, I'm looking at it now, and I'm like, should we rank this one higher? Because this is such a good plant.
It is a hitter. This one's going to work zones 4 through 8, but I have seen it stretch into the heavier zone 8s and perform very well. Typically very quick growth rate on this one too. I mean, don't be afraid to get a little when it gets out there. Typically in 10 years, this one's already over 15 feet. So it does tend to exceed the growth rate of Acer griseum, give you a little bit larger tree, which is fun too because you can shade out some of your other maple collections with something like Acer triflorum. I think there's way more room for diversity here. I would love to see, 20 more selections of Acer triflorum done. We need a variegated one. We need a weeping one. Just such a fun category, and I think it hasn't really even been tapped as a resource yet for cultivars. I mean, there's only been a few, and I know there's a couple different ones, but we do try to bring back the Arium from time to time, which can get some nice yellow to it in the spring. I know Tom Cox had one named Bark Envy for kind of he thought a different style bark to it. Some of those may be hybrids. Really interesting section, though, and I would love to see more selections of triflorum.
I think one of the biggest problems with looking into Acer triflorum is so many of their seeds are typically parthenocarpic. That means that the seeds themselves are empty hulls, and there's not an actual seed inside of that when you get into that Samara. Now, with Acer triflorum, to get a higher percentage rate of seedlings that would come out of a seed set, you'd have to have lots of male and female Acer triflorums planted in one area together. And that's because with Acer triflorum, they don't have the female flowers and the male flowers on the same plant. And because of that, when you look through, if you find an Acer triflorum planted out somewhere and you look through the seeds, you don't get many to come up. So it would take planting a forest to really be able to start to find the diversity in Acer triflorum that you need to.
All right, now coming in here at number 15, we're back into section palmata. This was a weird one. This is another evergreen one in section palmata. We've got Acer fabri.
Guys, this is Faber's maple, and I don't like that common name.
You never use that.
So we adopted what Donlin Jane of UGA started saying, and that was the emerald jade maple.
And it just sounds cooler.
It does. It does. And Acer fabri has one of the shiniest foliage of any of the maples, and especially any of the evergreen maples. It is very showy, and it gets red samaras that hang down off of the shiny dark green foliage, contrasting so well. I mean, this is an amazing evergreen tree. It makes a good mid-sized tree. And in China, they use this as a bonsai.
Yeah, it is a weird one. This one's going to work zone 6 through 10. So it won't go into that zone 5, but it'll go everywhere else maples will, plus zone 10, being a little more heat tolerant. And it's often used as an indoor plant, which is pretty cool. I need to try that. I've often thought about bringing one in. It's so unique. You'll see it. It looks so different. It's one of the things I would think is probably the most shocking to think of closely related to what we think of as Japanese maples like palmatums. But I mean, it grafts onto palmatum no differently than Acer japonicum. There's very few selections in this category. We did one point have a David's dwarf, which was a contorted dwarf form of this. Very unique, very different. I love, one of my favorite things about this tree is the samaras. So when you get those shrimp pink to almost bright red samaras, I think it gives it such a fun flowering characteristic. There's one there at the J.C. Ralston, very nice older specimen of this. And when those seeds really get nice and ripe on that plant, they just look so ornamental. I mean, I think they give it a whole new aesthetic on that dark green, glossy foliage. Sometimes you can get some kind of pinkish new growth on that, but with that dark green foliage in the summer and you got that shrimp pink colored samara on there, I think it really adds an ornamental quality.
I just got some red-eyed tree frogs, and thinking about the terrarium, an Acer fabri would be a killer maple to put in that indoor setting for the tree frogs.
I warned his wife. She was like, Tim's getting some terrarium with some tree frogs. And I was like, this doesn't end until your whole backyard is dedicated to turtles and frogs. You have no idea the Pandora's box you've opened here.
Hey, guys, I used to want to be a herpetologist before maples, so give me some space on that. But Acer fabri is an amazing plant with some shiny, bright green foliage. That's that dark green foliage, but that the seeds just show so well on this plant. And because it makes such a great tree out there. And in some zones, in those colder zones, this is going to be semi-deciduous. So it'll drop its foliage, but it'll often release back out in the spring with your Japanese maples.
Now, we're in 6B here, and we have a lot of our plants in greenhouses, so they don't get quite as cold as an outdoor 6B, but we do dry these out because we don't water as frequently in the winter. So they typically do go completely deciduous for us here at our nursery and then re-leaf in the spring. So now whether that's based on coldness or based on how much we dry out our greenhouses in the winter, but an interesting cultivar, an interesting selection of species that I think more cultivars should be done of. It'd be really fun to see, weeping forms of this, variegated forms of this. This is one, the sky's the limit for selection on this.
All right, guys, coming at number 14, we've got Acer campbelli. And Acer campbelli is such a broad category. I mean, this fits so many different species. And, we've grown Acer campbelli subspecies fabellatum. We've grown subspecies sinense. And basically, a lot of times, I think almost many of the people who are going out there collecting use Acer campbelli as almost a catch-all because so many times they'll say, oh, I found this in Taiwan. I found this in China. It looks like Acer campbelli.
Right.
But it is such a cool plant, but particularly that campbelli subspecies sinense, that is my favorite among all the Acer campbelli.
Now that Dr. Keith Arboretum, that when Charlie Keith had that, I'll have to go visit it again. I know it's now a subdivision, and they've actually kept some of the gardens there, but there was a Acer campbelli subspecies sinense in that garden, and I went to it, and it was in perfect fall color. And dang, if that probably wasn't one of my favorite fall colored trees ever. It had, reds infused with oranges and yellows, and it just gave it a fiery look. It was so beautiful and a really fun plant to be growing. Now, whether you're growing the straight species, there are a few cultivars of this, not many. I think probably the most famous cultivar of this is still very obscure, but would be Acer campbelli bony fingers, which is a Talon Buchholz, I believe, introduction. Really funky, contorted growth on that one. Kind of looks like weird bony fingers sticking out of it. And those are a little bit less cold tolerant. I believe we list that one typically as like a 6 through 9, so a little less than your palmatums sometimes. Although I have had one successfully here in zone 6, in the ground for several years. Bony fingers, one of the weirder, I would say, cultivar selections out there on our list.
It is one of the weirder ones. Exuberance is another one by Talon Buchholz they introduced of the campbelli. And after Douglas Justice did his presentation to the Maple Society, I know that there are red forms out there. There are red forms that are just growing in the wild out there as these unique traits that have a distinguishing characteristic of having that color to them rather than being your pure green. And I'm like, man, we need some of those in the nursery trade. Yeah, those would start opening and broadening people's minds with Acer campbelli.
He had footage. I think we have some of that on our channel too. You can go see some of his presentation we have here on our YouTube channel for Douglas Justice. And he goes into like that Five Fingers region in Vietnam and does wild collecting. And we were just blown away by some of the straight species. Now, again, there's always, interesting variation even with the straight species. But like Tim said, he was finding reds that would instantly get cultivar status. I mean, if you had that here, I think there was a ton of commercial value to a really nice Acer campbelli with, blood good to Emperor 1 kind of color to it.
Now, coming in at number 13, we've got the paper bark maple, Acer gricium.
This one's awesome. I mean, you probably know Acer gricium. It's the Chinese paper bark maple. This one's going to work zones 4 through 8, so a little bit less heat tolerant than that zone 9, but it can extend down to that zone 4, so it does work for some of you folks in some of those colder zones. Gives you that cinnamon flake peeling type bark. Everybody loves this one because it looks like cinnamon. I mean, that's really one of the things that draws people into this. It's got a very unique style bark interest to it that is distinctly Acer gricium. And once you've identified it, you'll see them everywhere. You can't miss this one once you understand what it does.
Yeah, and there aren't many selections of this whenever it comes to different cultivars. Most of the selections have been made are hybrids with Acer gricium and other different species. But Acer gricium, the paper bark maple, was introduced into Western civilization by E.H. Wilson. And two of those plants are at Harvard University. And they're still there after, it's like over 100 and something years, it's there at Harvard. And Matt and I got to go visit the gardens and see these Acer gricium in person. I mean, just to see a tree that's that old and is one of the plants that many of the Acer griciums came from today is pretty spectacular.
Yeah, really cool plant. Again, one that's kind of highly parthenocarpic, so you don't get a lot of viability from seed. Maybe that different parts of the flower and the stamen and everything are expressed at different times. For whatever reason, it's very hard to get viable seed on this one. So a very low percentage of the seed come out fully developed. And it is an endangered one. It's on that red maples list because it's not one that's very, prolific there in the wild either. So it's very hard to get, basically this tree to seed and have good, healthy seed to it. Now, great fall colors. This one has a lot of ornamental traits. It's going to make a larger overall tree, typically in that 20 to 25 foot range. But it's going to have great red fall color too. Like Acer gricium has similar style foliage to that Acer triflorum. It's in that same family, and it has exceptional bold reds to even bright red fall color.
Now, when Matt was the president of the Maple Society, this is one of the things they started funding was the Acer Grisham project. And what the Maple Society does is they try to find ways to promote maples in many different ways. And one of that way is through conservation. And what they did is they had plant explorers who went back out and did new collections of Acer Grisham to diversify the gene pool of Acer Grisham in cultivation so that later down the road we can preserve more of that gene pool rather than what is just that first collection from E.H. Wilson in the late 1800s. So, I mean, check out the Acer Grisham project if you want. It's just a cool way that they're trying to make sure that we have Acer Grisham for generations to come.
All right, guys, coming in here at number 12, we've got another super rare Acer species. We're going back to Section Palmata. Yeah, we're big Section Palmata fans. We've got Acer calcaratum. Now, this is probably one of the most obscure rare maples in the world, and it's extremely obscure. I think we're the only place that's ever offered it in the United States. Our successions do go back to Westonbirt Arboretum. It is an extremely weird plant that most people never see seed either.
Now, Momiji is the turtle foot, right? And Cayade is the frog foot. Well, the interesting thing is this thing has more of that Cayade leaf to it. I mean, it's got that weird shaped leaf that looks almost like a trident maple leaf. And it's in Section Palmata. The leaves get, a good size to them. But the new growth on this is like a bright pink to orange and then fading down to the pink to the orange to lime green to a light green. And so the new colors on the new growth on this plant are outstanding.
Yeah, you can get just some really nice foliage diversity going on there on that new growth flush. Some nice fall color, too. I've had it range from bold yellows to really bold oranges. I've seen some reds sometimes. This one works. We listed zone 7 through 9. Again, it grafts right onto Section Palmata. So this is going to graft onto palmatum understock. Typically, if we're producing it here at our nursery, we do graft it onto palmatum. We had a really nice one in the ground here. We're zone 6B. And I probably had one go through -9. Had it go through some extreme conditions, and I was really starting to almost think about rating this one into zone 6. It did get taken out by an extremely late cold freeze. To be fair, that cold freeze did affect some palmatums as well. We still do list it as zone 7 like the Royal Horticultural Society would, but it does have some really interesting ornamental qualities. I like how glossy the foliage is. It's one that oftentimes no one had ever seen seed before, even in its native habitat. There's some really nice older specimens of this at Westonbirt Arboretum at the actually, when I first saw this, I was at Arboretum Trompenberg, and I was walking around with Cor Van Gelder, and it just caught my eye. I thought, this is so weird. I've got to be growing this. That glossy sheen to it really gives it a little something extra, especially juvenile plants getting that shrimp pink new growth too, I think gives it a real nice ornamental quality.
And Matt and I, we like to try plants, even if the books say, hey, this doesn't grow in your area. It's because the plants don't read books. And, you may often find exceptions or find that someone in the book was making a generalization about something they thought it might only be to your zone, but it may actually be able to go a little bit colder. And so we often will grow plants anyways. I know Tony Avent's a big proponent of that because if you're not killing plants, you're not really gardening. You're not learning about the plants. And the Acer calcaratum really survived, it was probably 12 foot and survived through many different things until we had a really, really bad late cold snap that killed some other maples in our yard, some other Japanese maples in our yard. So I really don't even, the verdict's out is whether this could actually typically handle our zone. But an amazing plant, extremely rare, and something you don't see very often in the nursery trade.
All right, this next one may be controversial. I think
dun, dun, dun.
Controversial. You laugh. I went to the Maple Society meeting in Europe, and man, you don't argue about what species these are. There's keys. People get pretty heated. Some of those discussions, like the Americans laugh, they're like, oh, heated. Well, I'm telling you, I was in a almost street fight that occurred because people got to a different answer with their keys. I got heated. I was out of my element. It quickly left my language, and I was like, wow, I don't even know what I'm saying anymore. But it can get quite heated with some of these different cultivar species descriptions, especially when you key them out. Now, Acer olivaceum technically is a species without a place. So a lot of people would tell you that's a misnomer, that it's actually part of Acer elegantium, and that it isn't truly its own thing.
And I would say they're wrong.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. we don't actually know when this was wild collected. We need more data on specifically when Acer olivaceum was collected.
The strand we got of Acer olivaceum came from the Dr. Keith Arboretum, and it came directly from J.D. Vertrees. And it was pretty cool when we were actually at, visiting Dr. Keith years ago, and he's like, oh, this came from Vertrees. And then we were out in Oregon going through the J.D. Vertrees archives, reading the letters between Dr. Keith and J.D. Vertrees about trading all these species. And so we can source for a fact that Acer olivaceum came through J.D. Vertrees to him. And at some point, a botanist, when Acer olivaceum was its own species, put this in with its own species. And I truly think that it stands out and is its own distinct species from many of the other species that we grow.
Yeah, very heat tolerant. We list this one as 7 through 9, although I can tell you there's a massive, we did a video on it on our YouTube channel, one growing in zone 6 seeding here. There's, a 20-foot specimen in zone 6B now that has withstood. So I think we can probably safely go ahead and upgrade that one to zone 6 when there's a 20-year-old one now. A beautiful tree. It's said to be native of the Zhejiang province. Now, again, I think we would have to probably get into a little bit more of the actual original collection data to confirm a lot of this on its, its species status. But I can tell you this is a really nice plant. It's definitely different than what it's most commonly mixed up with, which is Acer oliviernum. Acer olivaceum has a real soft touch to it, and it actually has some really great yellows to oranges in that fall color. I like that it holds its fall color typically a little bit later than a lot of our palmatums, which is interesting. And it's a good grower, too. It typically, I would say even in 10 years, it's not uncommon to be in that 14-foot kind of range, 15-foot kind of range. So it gets out there nicely. I think future selections and maybe even our Heat Seeker series could be made in this section. Now, we might just have to call it Acer X till we get figured out there. But I definitely think that olivaceum has a lot of merit. And from everything I've seen, it's a very unique and interesting plant.
If it was considered an Acer palmatum selection, you put a cultivar name on it, to me, it'd be in my top 5 fall colors. And it's because it consistently gives you a 2-tone fall color that is outstanding, sometimes even 3-tone with yellows, oranges, and reds all at the same time. This is a great small to mid-sized tree that more people need to be growing. It grafts on palmatum, it's in section palmata, and I truly think that it is extremely distinctive from Acer elegantium. What we have as Acer olivaceum is not the same as Acer elegantium. What we often see in a lot of these species is we have lots of different people who are out there wild collecting. And there may be a specimen out there somewhere labeled Acer olivaceum that is Acer elegantium, and then someone says, oh, those two are synonymous. But that just means that someone keyed the original Acer olivaceum wrong, and it was really an Acer elegantium. And just because there's a specimen out there that was wild collected doesn't always necessarily mean that that species doesn't exist. So I think there's a lot of confusion that happens there because we are dealing with Flora of China, which are books of drawings, and then going out there trying to identify it with many different explorers who are doing this. And so there's a lot of still gray area out there in this wild collection of maples. You think it would be by today's standards that everything would be a matter of fact, but there's a lot of gray area there.
Yeah, and if you're one of those people from the European Maple Society that gets really fired up mad over this and you want to punch someone in the face, Tim is smaller than me. He's the younger brother. I outweigh him by a good bit. I think it'd be easier to go after him first. I'm just saying. Coming in here at number 10, we've got Acer pubipalmatum.
Guys, this is an amazing species. It's one that I fell in love with because it's fall color. And this thing...
It's a weird one.
It has a pubescence to it. And that's where it gets that pubipalmatum in there. It looks like a Japanese maple's foliage, but you get that pubescence that you get on Seboldianum.
It's got these little weird hairs going on.
It does, right on the stem. And the fall color can rival Osakazuki. I mean, it is a bright, bright, bright red in the fall.
I only know of 2 selections in this category, and they're both made here. So we've got Flying Daggers, which turns into like almost more of a Makawa-shaped tree, which is really cool. You'll have to check out our upcoming video on most outrageous plants at Buckholtz Nursery. We do highlight one of our own Flying Daggers there that is in a 10-gallon and is a gorgeous specimen. We really selected that one for its leaf shape, having a more of a linear lobulum almost style leaf, giving it that Flying Daggers name, but also brilliant scarlet to almost pink red fall color. Like Tim said, sometimes the species here can rival Osakazuki. We also have a variegated selection of this one in the works. Poopy palmatum is a great species. Like this one, it's as closely related to section palmata. Again, it's in section palmata, so it's as closely related to palmatum, what we think of as Japanese maples, as Acer japonicum. So there's a lot of room for selecting to be done here, and there's a lot of unique traits amongst this category too. It's very drought resistant. It gets some nice striations in the bark as too, so you can actually get some interesting bark interest on this as it develops. And as Tim said, it has that pubescence to it, so it does get a little bit more of a like a little hairy look on the stems. Now, this one we typically list zone 6 through 9, so not quite as cold tolerant sometimes as straight section palmata, as Acer palmatum, but a really unique one to be growing. And I think a plant that a lot more selection can be done in. I think there's going to be more unique cultivars that come out of there in the future.
Now, I do know of some Poopy palmatum growing in Illinois. And so, it may be even a zone 5 plant once they go through and do this full trial. Again, many of this floral wonder that this flora of China that we're looking at, and we're saying, hey, this is the zone, this is the zone, this is the zone. It's based on people's assumptions of these species. And many of these species are proving to be much more cold tolerant than we originally thought.
Mark Weatherden's the first to point out, like we'll talk about even Acer fabry only working in certain zones, and then he'll point out that some of where they're wild collecting these in China are in colder regions on mountains than we are here. And so the same could be said of Poopy palmatum. I mean, some of these things are collected in much colder areas than our USDA zone we're associating with them. So there could be some variance there amongst that species as well.
Coming in at number 9, we've got Acer subuldianum.
Yeah, now we're getting into a few of your favorite, and more common Japanese maple selections. There's a lot of cool trees in subuldianum. I would say one of the main factors there is that cold tolerance. People like Acer subuldianum because it is a little more durable for those zone 4 winters. I think to really push it needs to be grafted onto subuldianum, but it's an interesting place to give plants superpowers. Tim and I always like to talk about giving maples superpowers, and selecting an Acer subuldianum is a great way to do that.
Now, Seabold was one of those original plant explorers. He was one of those guys who was actually, I think he was a physician or an optometrist, and he would go work on people's eyes and help them out, and he'd be loading his boat full of plants from Japan. And that's why you see Seabold or Seaboldii on so many plants from Japan, is because he was the botanist that was bringing those back to Western civilization when the Japanese culture wasn't allowing many of those plants out in any other form. And so he was able to actually get so many cool plants out of Japan and introduce them to Western civilization and make them popular in gardening today.
Yeah, Seabold was bringing a lot of those trees back to Holland and to that region. I know a lot of his original plants ended up at Esveld, but even some of them are still at Arboretum Trompenberg there. Really cool, little interesting piece of history. He would kind of work on eyes as an optometrist until they realized that he was robbing everybody blind to the local flora, and then he would escape for his life, get back in the ship, sail back to Holland and dump all he had, then go to another region, start working on eyes and helping everybody with their vision, all while stealing as many cool plants as possible. I think all of us plant people can appreciate that a little bit. But because of that, we have so many nice cold-tolerant selections. I mean, I can tell you a few of my favorites, like Seki no Kigon, which is a weeping form of Seaboldianum. I think that really pushes where this genre could go, having a weeping form. Many of the selections you're seeing probably do have some hybridization with palmatum too, to give them some lace leaf-like traits and other things. But there's so many cool straight Seaboldianum traits. I mean, like variegation. I mean, we've got some crazy stuff going on now. There's a lot of selections in this category.
Now, this has a leaf that's more rounded, almost like a full moon maple. It gives such a fun feel out there in the landscape. And like Matt said, many of these selections are actually their finding of Seaboldianum are wild collected, like the Seki no Kigon. That was just found out in the wild as a weeping selection. Mm-hmm. And then there's so many ones that are starting to hybridize with some of the other Japanese maples that are getting very unique characteristics. I don't know for a fact that Kumoi Nishiki is a hybrid or just a straight species, but that variegation on a full moon style foliage is outrageous. And starts to be there's more and more selections being made in Acer subuldianum almost every day. I mean, Shuro no Sume, the claw of the dragon maple with that claw-like foliage that's almost like a linerlobum. It's like a linerlobum crossed with like a Kamagata style. I mean, it's so fun, so different. And there's so many cool selections, but subuldianums consistently give you good fall color. And sometimes they're yellow infused with orange, and sometimes they're red. but they just give you good fall color almost each and every time.
All right, y'all, coming in here at number 8, you Texans are going to be happy. And you Oklahomans and everybody in the hot South, we've got Acer truncatum. Now, Acer truncatum is a personal favorite of ours here at Mr. Maple. We're working to get a ton of new selections out there to you. Acer truncatum is an interesting plant. It's very durable. We do list it zones 5 through 9, which sounds just like palmatum, but I would say it can push that heat tolerance in that heavy zone 9. They can handle a little bit more full sun than some of these others on the list in that zone 9.
The purple blow maple.
That is a terrible name.
Terrible name.
Doesn't make any sense.
That's why I like when Keith Johansson calls it the Shantung maple.
He also calls it the Shandoon.
Shandoon. I guess that's maybe the correct way to pronounce it. But the Shantung maple is one of the most heat tolerant trees out there. This is a tree that is super heat tolerant, makes a large tree, and gives you some shade out there in high heat settings. It can handle colder zones too, but it's really noted for being a tree that grows fast and does well in those high heat settings. And it's really tolerant of those more alkaline soils, which makes it great for the South and the Midwest, where you have more of those alkaline soils.
It's also one that's going to get out there quickly, so it provides a good shade for your less durable plants in sun. It's not uncommon for this tree to be 25 feet in 15 years, so it's going to fill out pretty quickly. It's got great exfoliating bark, so it kind of has more, not really exfoliating, probably the better way to describe it's almost like a pine bark, fissured bark. And for that reason, it actually looks really cool as a bonsai as well. I've seen Keith and Scott do some really cool bonsais. Definitely go check out our full podcast with Scott Hubble of Metro Maples.
Yeah, there's so many cool selections from golden ones to ones with red fall color, dwarf selections. And there's going to be a lot more work done with Acer truncatum down the road because of all the selections and work that Keith and Scott have already done. I think that's going to continue to be something that people looking more and more to because of how well they perform in those extreme high heat areas in the southern United States.
Hey, I celebrate Keith's entire catalog. It's like the guys on Office Space that celebrate Michael Bolton's full catalog. I celebrate the full catalog of introductions by Keith Johansson. And we get a lot of questions when we're going to be offering those. We do sporadically. I know they pop up a lot in our one-on-one sales and things like that. We've had a few bad years on seed for Acer truncatums, but we are working, and we've got some good sources going now. We will be offering close to 20 different selections here. Maybe it takes us a year to get completely up to all of them, but we have over 20 selections of truncatum to be offering you here mail order. So don't be afraid to wait on those. We're going to have them mail order to the entire country. We ship anywhere in the continental U.S. We'll be bringing things like Baby Dragon, Super Dragon, and Fire Dragon back to mail order.
Coming at number 7, we have Acer pseudosubuldianum.
Ah, man, poor pseudosubuldianum. When is it going to quit being called a fake subuldianum? This poor guy, man. I feel bad for it. It's time to embrace pseudosubuldianum as not just being the fake subuldianum.
I thought it was crazy when the Maple Society was talking with Paul Hallidan about some of his hybrids, and he said that in the wild where Acer pseudosubuldianum actually is, there's lions and tigers and bears. Oh my.
He could not do it. I knew it was coming. It is such a cool plant. It is super durable. Again, one that stretches down to zone 4, so it's got some of those superpowers going on. And again, a lot of the newer selections of Acer pseudosubuldianum are probably hybrids with palmatum, giving them some more ornamental traits. But there's a lot going on there. There's a lot to be done. I know one of my very favorite species resides in this category. It's a mouthful. We did a video kind of joking about this one with people, but it's Acer pseudosubuldianum subspecies Taka semense. So a bit of a mouthful there for sure. One of my all-time favorite species maples. The natural species is from the Oolong-Do Island, and it's a narrow columnar plant, so it wants to be very narrow. Again, some of the oldest specimens of that are at the Arnold Arboretum we got to see. It wants to be very ovate and narrow. Again, that could give you maybe the best fall color of any maple I've ever seen. I know that could probably even give that Acer campbellii subspecies sinense a run. It is probably one of the most beautiful trees I've ever seen when it's at its peak fall color. I have about a 14-foot one in my yard now. I actually have it up close to the house because that narrow columnar shape allows it to go pretty close to my porch. I remember I was at Westernbird Arboretum walking around with Peter Gregory, and there was people taking photos of everything. There was a photo contest going on, and I took some pictures of this one, and it was metallic red. Like, it was just peak fall color, oranges, yellows, reds, and almost metallic-y red on some of the growth. And that was one of the first times I'd ever just become awestruck by this maple. I was like, what is this? I've got to be growing it. And now I have a giant one in my yard I love as well.
Yeah, the Oolong-Do Island is between North Korea. It's an island between North Korea and Japan. And it's just this weird island that gets a lot of that Siberian just hit constantly with the cold from Siberia. And it is just amazing that the cold tolerant plants that are coming from Ulangdu Island. And Takasamentse comes from there. It's extremely cold tolerant, great fall color. But the foliage on this is one of the things that makes the Acer Takasamentse or Acer pseudosubordinum subspecies Takasamentse so great. The foliage itself is probably one of the most rounded leaves of any of the Japanese maples. It probably has an even more rounded foliage than Acer shirasawanum aureum, which people consider the full moon Japanese maple, the golden full moon. And Takasamentse has an even more rounded foliage to it. It is so amazing in the fall. And that's one of the reasons why Matt's got it there in his yard. Because
it has a lot of what I like about shirasawanum and a lot of what I like about Acer japonicum all in one plant. Like, it just really captures a lot. I mean, it's a tree that I look at and it's green, as much as when it's in its fall color. I mean, it can really catch the eye. I noticed someone in our green podcast said, I know that one's coming up. And I said, we didn't cover any species in this one. It was our favorite cultivars, but that one is near and dear to my heart for an exceptional green Japanese maple with maybe my favorite fall color. It's it would be splitting hairs, but it's up there for best fall color maple.
And I think there's been a lot of people who try to say, hey, I've got a more narrow selection. And the straight species, like Matt was mentioning earlier, is more narrow. And that because that is so easy to use in the garden, because it doesn't have a very widespreading habit to it, and you still get great fall color. So check out Acer pseudosubordinum, especially subspecies Takasamentse.
All right, coming in here at number 6, we've got Acer bajurianum. Now, loaded category here, guys. This one has so many cool cultivars. The species is so useful. The species can often be used as street trees because it's more durable. It's very heat tolerant. We listed as zones 5 through 9 as well, but it can handle a good bit of heat in those heavy zone 8s. And just a durable as nails plant. That's one of the reasons why trident maples are amongst the most popular for bonsai as well.
So some people say that Acer bajurianum is super spectacular, but I also like Acer bajurianum subspecies formosanum. And that is the Acer bajurianum selections that have that more cartoon-like leaf. Formosanum, when you see that subspecies indicator, that often means of Taiwan. So it's the Taiwanese trident maple. And they just have a more cartoon-like trident maple leaf to it. I know some of our selections, like, for instance, Miyadano, for instance, and Miyasama Yatsubusa are that subspecies Formosanum on the Acer bajurianum. And that is such a fun species in itself. And they all fit under that trident maple, that Acer bajurianum category.
We do a ton of trident maples here. I don't know of a selection that we don't offer. I'm a huge fan of this one from Waco Nishiki, which can leaf out completely white, to interesting, almost lace leaf forms like Mino Yatsubusa that have that elongated foliage. There's so many interesting variegations. We actually named one here Golden Pharaoh because it has yellow with reticulated veins to it. One that's oddly a fan favorite every time we offer it is that Acer bajurianum Naruto.
Yeah, it has that leaves that cup upward look like little origami birds flying. And when you have a large tree, it looks like tons of birds in flight of origami birds. Such an amazing plant, sometimes referred to as tancho. We've been told that those are, in fact, the same plant. Amazing species right there with Acer bajurianum.
Yeah, Michael Steinhardt's one that Don Shadow named, and it's one of the better yellows. I mean, you can put this out in full sun, exceptional yellow, durable, consistent oranges in the fall. There's so many cool characteristics here. I mean, a lot of these can be used as full upright size trees. Ingia weeping gives you that semi-pendulous, almost weeping cherry type form to it. Tim and I are working on a selection called Slide and Rock that's a little more Ryusen shaped. So a pretty cool one there. But yeah, there's some really, there's not enough to ever trident maples. There could always be new and interesting ones. One thing that makes it really popular for bonsai too is it has indeterminate growth. So you can kind of get branches that do move around a little bit on the bark. So with other maples that have more determinate type growth, you won't have a branch that raises up on you. But with a trident maple, it actually can continue to grow from all areas.
So coming in at number 5, we've got Acer pictum, sometimes called Acer mono. Amazing plant.
Oh, pictums, man. Oh, yeah, be still my heart. There's so many crazy Acer pictums. Now, the straight species has that big batwing style maple. That's why it's often referred to as the batwing maple. So there's a beautiful specimen of the straight species that was planted here in Hendersonville, North Carolina. That was a wild collected Acer pictum that's just here, used as a street tree because it's so durable. And this one just has that large batwing style pictum leaf. Now, there's so many great selections of that made now. Like many of you are familiar, if you're long-term listeners of the Mr. Maple Show, or just people that subscribe to our weekly email, make sure to subscribe to that. We put out 10 new trees every single Tuesday at 10. Usugumo, when that hits that 10 at 10, it sells out. Acer Pictum Usugumo, we often refer to that one as the batwing because it has that creepy swirling variegation. So it even looks a little bit more like a batwing with that reticulated veining going on in there. Man, when you get into some of the variegated pictums, now you're talking my language. I love these things.
One of my favorite pictums we've ever saw was when Matt and I were at Nikko National Park in Japan, and we're walking around on the ground there, and we look up and we see this, we're talking, maybe 40, 50-foot tree. I mean, maybe even been 100 foot. I mean, it was huge. We look like a dot when you look at the photo and below it. And it's in perfect yellow fall color. And it's just this huge Acer pictum. And just seeing something of that size and seeing a batwing maple of that size was something pretty spectacular for me. But there's so many cool selections like Matt talked about. Naguri Nishiki, I mean, that is...
Bright white.
I mean, you get Kamasaki Nishiki, which gets those splotches of white. You've got so many fun plants like Hoshiadori, which is a selection from one of those older selections from Japan that has yellow variegation on the batwing. I mean, there's so many fun selections out there, but the straight species, like you mentioned, that street tree that they're using in Hendersonville that was wild collected in the Gifu Prefecture.
Yeah.
I mean, amazing in itself.
More should be made of selections that aren't just variegated. I think the variegated ones steal all the attention. It's a cool platform. It's durable. It's exceptionally heat tolerant. It's got a very regal style leaf to it. It's easy to find. It's easy to get drawn to those variegated selections because there's so many gorgeous variegated selections. It's easy for those to just take over the whole category. But I think even the straight species has a real beauty to it.
Now, there are some pictums, too, that are pictum dissecums or pictum dissectums that look very truncatum-like. For instance, the cultivar Akakazi Nishiki, forever in the United States, was sold as an Acer truncatum Akakazi Nishiki until people started realizing, hey, this was a selection from Japan, and they don't have truncatum growing naturally in Japan. They've got pictum dissectum. And it looks very similar to when you get that pictum dissectum that's more divided foliage to a truncatum. But we've got Akakazi Nishiki, we have Akakazi Yutaka,
which is an even more variegated form,
and Inko Nishiki.
Yeah, Inko Nishiki is one that we'll be offering here at Mr. Maple almost exclusively at first. I don't think it's out there anywhere else in the U.S. And it is a bright white to neon pink form, really interesting. Acer pictums really bring it. They're a little more heat tolerant. We list them as zones 5 through 9. Again, they can push into those hotter zones and really do exceptional. Just a beautiful overall plant. And again, I think the straight species doesn't get enough love. We need to be offering it more. It is gorgeous.
So guys, coming in at number 4, we've got Oliver's Maple, Acer oliveranum.
Now, we like this one. If you've followed our show at all, we selected Hot Blonde. We have a whole Heat Seeker series that are likely Palmatum X or Shirasawanum X olivieranums because we think this is one of the coolest categories. Acer olivieranums are a Chinese maple, and they're closely related to Japanese maple. So when most people look at them, it's essentially going to remind people of a Japanese maple, but sometimes it has a little bit of extra traits to it. And that Acer olivieranum, one, makes them faster growing, but it also makes them more heat tolerant.
Yeah, Acer oliveranum was one of those plants that when we would have visitors come visit the nursery, when we would, we're a specialized nursery, we'd have people who were visiting from Texas. They would ask for Acer oliveranum by name. And it's because it was extremely heat tolerant and it gave them a good red fall color, even in the deep south. And that's a pretty spectacular feat for a mid-sized tree. You've got a tree that's not putting deep roots out there in the landscape, but yet it's able to handle the high heat settings of somewhere like Texas. Mm-hmm. And it's able to handle more sunlight. And Acer oliveranum fits that bill and gives you some amazing colors, even in that higher heat and higher humid situations.
So there's several different things in this category of subspecies. We tend to favor the Acer olivieranum subspecies olivieranum because it's a little more cold tolerant. Typically, we list those as 6 through 9. There is Acer olivieranum subspecies formosanum, which I believe most people now are just listing as Acer cerulatum.
Now, that makes a great tree in itself with bright orange fall color. I know we went down there and visited Norman Winter down there in South Carolina at the bamboo farm, And they had an amazing specimen that was planted by the USDA years and years ago.
It's like a 40-foot one at the Gulf Coast Botanical Garden.
I mean, it is extremely old, extremely beautiful, and makes a good mid-sized tree down there in that high heat setting. But that subspecies Formosanum wouldn't do so well for someone in a zone 6 typically. Typically, those are about a zone 7 through 9 plant. Maybe even, they might push down to even zone 10. But Acer oliveranum, variety oliveranum, is typically for us, a zone 6 plant. And then some of our selections like Hot Blonde, we believe may actually be in Shirasawanum X oliveranum, which may give it an additional cold tolerance.
Yeah, we are working on one in that Formosanum category, which is the Hot Rod, which has a bihu-like bark to it. So it has bright yellow stemming to it. Will work really great for some of those people in those really high heat zones that want a very interesting winter interest, Acer oliveranum. Awesome category, brings all that high heat, all that great fall color, and everything you love typically about maples, to some of those hotter zones for sure.
Now, Acer oliveranum is naturally found in China, Taiwan, and many places out there in Asia. It is a very, very more common Acer that's found, just growing in the wild, but these selections are pretty rare. I mean, there's not many selections being made in Acer oliveranum except the ones that Masayoshiano did that we got to name here at Mr. Maple, and our selections we've made here as well.
Yeah, so a lot of people know about Hot Blonde, likely a hybrid with Acer Shirasawanum aureum, giving it even more cold tolerance to it. Probably one of our best introductions we've ever done here at Mr. Maple. We also do hot sauce and hot tamale. Now, hot sauce is a bright red form, and hot tamale is like a greener, older growth to like bright pink new growth on it. Exceptional selections. We're actually working on one more that we didn't wild collect. We collected at World Maple Park with Yano, and we were so gracious. We were talking to Yano-san about these selections, and he was saying, well, you need to put a different name on it if you introduce it than what's on there. That's just a placeholder. And he allowed us to collect some seed on it. And we were joking about calling this one Hot Chicken. It kind of has like these little feathers hanging off of it. It's almost a little bit more of a sessilifolium style for an Acer oliveranum. So lots of cool things there in the works, making it come in at number 4 on our list.
Matt, number 3, I think you're a big fan.
I'm a big fan of Acer japonicums. Put that on a t-shirt. I say I'm a big fan a lot. I was like, Acer japonicums are literally a big fan. I'm going to make a t-shirt that says I'm a big fan of Acer japonicums. When I see somebody wearing that shirt out in public, I go, did we just become best friends? If the guy walked up to me wearing an Acer, I'm a big fan of Acer oliveranum, or I'm a big fan of Acer japonicum shirts, I'm like, I like this guy. Let's kick it with this guy. I'm having dinner with him.
So, Matt, what do you like about Acer japonicum?
I like everything about Acer japonicum. I like the big fans. I like the larger seeds. I like the larger blooms. I like the larger foliage. I like that everything is a little bit bigger with Acer japonicum. It's a little bit more showy. The fall colors are exceptional, but that large foliage, that's really what draws people in.
I thought it was interesting when Augustin Coelho Vera was here and we were learning about senescence. And we got a whole video on senescence on our YouTube channel. And he was particularly talking to us later about Acer japonicum aconitifolium, also known as Mekujaku. And it changed with fall color based on the timing of the day, not necessarily the coldness, meaning you got a consistent fall color each and every year on that selection. I'm wondering if that's true with all Acer japonicums, because if so, that makes this whole category simply amazing, because with Acer japonicums, you get a consistent fall color each and every year. And I'm wondering if it's because of, how it goes to senescence, how it goes to fall color. Is it the coldness or is it the timing of the day? Because if it's the timing of the day, that means everyone can enjoy an amazing fall color on Acer japonicums.
Yeah, they're very consistent. When you look at those mountainside pictures of Japan and you see these sprawling mountains with just amazing colors, typically what you're seeing in those pictures from like aerial shots are Acer japonicums. Not uncommon. You've heard me say this a lot, and a lot of the selections to get reds, yellows, and oranges all at the same time. Many selections are made for that, that intense color change that they get, and they're very consistent. I think the fall color, is definitely one of the big drawing factors for why Acer japonicums are so popular. But I think underrated amongst all that is that red tassel flower. It's probably the Japanese maple with the most showy flower. And I think it's understated. I mean, especially when you get a big green cascade and it's got that weeping shape to it. It's almost like a lace leaf version of an Acer japonicum. You get those bright red tassel flowers on in the early spring. Really understated ornamental quality.
And those leaves are just so much bigger, which gives you such a bigger palette for that fall color to paint you a beautiful picture to enjoy. I mean, when this fall color starts coming in and you start seeing it from the outside of the foliage on an Acer japonicum working its way inward, with some of the green on the interior part of the foliage, it just paints itself a beautiful picture for you that you'll want to get out there and photograph. I mean, Acer japonicums, they're noted for having some of the best fall colors, and they really bring it in the fall.
Yeah, great section there. So many great cultivars of this. We've grafted and produced, I think, every selection. I don't know of a selection of Acer japonicum that we don't grow here at Mr. Maple because we're such big fans of it. There's some fun ones. I know we just recently had Blush and Beauty, which has like a blush of red over top of it. That was a selection by NJ Acer. You know, Talon Buchholz has Orange Fan, which has more of an orange blushing over it. There's so many unique characteristics of large leaf to lace leaf to gossamer. That's a tiny, straggly looking thing with all that interesting foliage. It looks like, almost threads. So you can get so many interesting traits going on just within this one genus. I love Acer japonicums.
We don't give NJ Acer Edshin enough credit for introducing some amazing plants. I mean, he's introduced Bazinga. He's introduced Blushing Beauty, Think Pink. I mean, so many amazing selections coming out of there in New Jersey. And he really knows his stuff when it comes to, cool new Japanese maples.
All right, coming in here at number 2, we've got the other full moon maple. Probably guessed it. If many of you y'all know your maples. Acer Shirasawanum, the full moon maple, coming in here at number 2.
Guys, Acer Shirasawanum. This is such a cool plant. It has that full moon maple style. You've got Acer Shirasawanum Aureum. You've got Moonrise. You've got so many awesome selections. You go down this from Palmettifolium, and then you get down to all of the ones that Jim Baggett and Dr. Al Mosley found together that Talon introduced, like Kauai, the lace leaf forms of Acer Shirasawanum Sensu. Mm-hmm. I mean, you get so many awesome plants there. I mean, an amazing species in itself, though. I mean, that large rounded leaf and some really good fall colors.
Here's a little bit of inside knowledge, too. A lot of those newer selections probably are hybrids with palmatum. So a lot of those weirder, more interesting traits probably are having some genetic drift with palmatum naturally. A lot of those come through the cultivar Acer Shirasawanum palmatifolium. So there's a huge selection of interesting plants. Even Trompenberg is a seedling from Acer Shirasawanum palmatifolium. A lot of those convex and interesting traits, especially some of those curled ones, are probably getting some Shirasawanum influence.
Acer Shirasawanum, again, that's one that we saw at Nikko National Park when we went to Japan. And seeing they've got some huge specimens around. Acer Shirasawanum Nikko is actually a seedling selection that was made by Esfeld Nursery at Nikko Park where Matt and I went.
There's some 50-foot Shirasawanums there around Lake Chujinji. Like, we need to go back there and film. It was brilliant. I mean, one of those beautiful places I've ever been. And we're talking 40 and 50-foot Acer Shirasawanums in fall color. I mean, as soon as you get out of the parking lot, like, we're standing in the parking lot and my jaw's on the ground already looking at this lake. It's crystal clear. There's people out on these swan boats just having a day. And not only is it brilliant to look at, the trees around this place, like as soon as you kind of let your eyes zoom back out from how beautiful this view is, you're like, man, we're standing next to a 40-foot Acer Shirasawanum right here. This thing is insane. You're talking 1.5 feet diameter on some of these things.
And you have to wonder about the age on these things because, nearby there at Nikko National Park, they've got those cryptomerias that are, close to 1,000 years old. Yeah. And you're like, how old are these Acer Shirasawanums that are here?
I mean, I would guess some of those are easily over 100 years. I mean, conservatively over 100 years old.
Yeah. But Acer Shirasawanum as a species gives you that rounded full moon style foliage, gives you a good fall color consistently as well. And it has a shorter, more shrubby-like habit a lot of times, and it will often get that darker colored bark to it. And it'll get like that browner, that light brown tan color bark to it as they mature.
Yeah, there's some classic introductions of this like Autumn Moon and Aureum. I'm a big fan of Acer Shirasawanum Moonrise. You've heard us talk about that one a lot on our channel. Moonrise for me is one of the best Shirasawanums you can be growing. It's got apricot to pink new growth over top of those chartreuse green undertones. So you can get a lot of color variation going on in there. Now, Tim and I actually recently, and we're going to be bringing it back in stock, introduced a cultivar that has more variegation to it, making it one of the first truly variegated Acer Shirasawanum selections called Magic Moon.
Yeah, and that's one of those plants that Matt and I, we introduced it a few years ago on Mr. Maple, but we sold too many of them. And so we had to really build up stock on them so that we could actually make them available again. And we often say whenever we're looking at, getting a tree in numbers, Matt's like, should we make it available? I'm like, look, Matt, we don't want to Magic Moon ourselves because
don't moon yourself.
because we have to make sure we have enough stock plants to be able to produce enough so that customers can actually, have this in their yard rather than selling 5 or 10 off. It's better if we keep those and produce, 100. And that's always our goal, is to be able to make these trees available the best that we can.
I'm telling Tim not to moon me all the time.
Guys, can you guess what number 1 is?
All right, coming in here at number 1, we've got Acer rubrum, the swamp maple.
No.
No, all right. We've got Acer palmatum. You could guess this one's number 1. 99% of our Japanese maples fall into this category of Acer palmatum. It has the most diversity. It has the most exceptional traits. We've devoted our entire lives talking to you about the gospel of Japanese maples in a way, and we couldn't do it without Acer palmatum. I mean, I would say that's the category that everybody gets fired up about for Japanese maples, and for good reason.
And I'd say it's the diversity in size, shape, form, texture, and color, and the ever-changing beauty throughout the season that grab everybody's attention with Japanese maples. There's a Japanese maple for every single person's spot in their garden. There's small ones, dwarf ones, large ones, different colors from yellow, red, green, white, purple. It seems unreal when it comes to Japanese maples, the diversity that is in that species.
I was talking to someone at the Maple Society last year, and they're like, how do you think we get to so much diversity of Acer palmatum? Like, how do you think we get this much? And I was talking to him, and I said, it's interesting because even in the 1700s, we have references to, the 1700s list in Japan. And there was this level of sophisticated collection going on in the 1700s just in this one species. So amongst Acer palmatum, we were already down to like maybe 36 different selections of really rare and unusual plants. They were already so sophisticated to have variegated, weeping habits, lace leaves, all these different forms going on, selections for fall color. I don't know of many other plant categories that have been cultivated for this kind of selection for this long.
And by 1882, there were so many more that would have been made after that. And then you look at today, and it just seems like we keep finding more new interesting traits each and every day.
I bet that guy in the 1700s had someone being like, guys, we got 36. We don't really need another one. We get blamed for naming too many maples here. If you look at our website, we've probably only named 15 to 20 that we've actually ever released. And again, a lot of those in really small numbers, not all those even in section palmata. But somebody always says, we don't really need another one until they see how cool that other one is.
That's so true. But guys, this was our top 20 maple species. Matt and I really put together a list. We had some honorable mentions here. I would say the sugar maples, which includes Scucci, and also your Acer leucodermae. Those came in as an honorable mention to us because we've got some really cool.
Acer pseudoplatanus. There's some really cool ones there. Acer campestre.
And those Acer critigifoliums and some of those snakebark maples, man. I had a hard time.
Get into that, yeah.
I had a hard time not putting them on these lists because those are such cool species that really deserve a lot of place. And Acer rubrum, I know you joked about it, number 1, but when you go around mountains of Western North Carolina in the fall and you see those reds in the mountains, that's the Acer rubrum, our native red maple. And it has one of the best fall colors. It's prized all around the world as a street tree because of its durability and because of its fall color. So it's hard not to mention those.
I'm still picking palmatum. Still picking palmatum over that.
Oh, of course.
Guys, if you like this kind of weekly talk show, make sure to subscribe to the Mr. Maple Show on all your favorite podcast platforms. We put the audio on all the major ones, but you can always check out the video on the Mr. Maple Show on YouTube. We air these videos every single Sunday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. So if you listen to us on one platform, don't be afraid to go check out another one. Those audio platforms are really blowing up. They've really been doing exceptional. We do a lot of cool interviews. We've got some really nice ones in the works for you as well.
Thanks so much for listening.
Take care.
God bless.
Have an awesome, wonderful night.